This feature is brought to you by JPH MP Direct, the companion site of the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice. Today, Drs. Christiaan Abildso and Renee Umstattd Meyer talk about creative solutions at the heart of rural communities.
Thank you for joining me on episode 1 of the Views from the Front Porch podcast series, talking about rural physical activity in the U.S. My name is Christiaan Abildso. I'm an associate professor at West Virginia University in the School of Public Health. I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Renee Umstattd Meyer from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Welcome, Dr. Umstattd Meyer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So would you tell us a little bit about yourself and the reasons for your interest in rural physical activity?
Surely. So as Dr. Abildso mentioned, I am at Baylor University right now here in Waco. And I grew up in Texas, and I grew up out in the country. And so that's probably the first place where it kind of ties me into rural roots, is having some of my own and always being able to be outside and be active, which drew me into the active living arena with my work as well as my personal time. But I think that some other pieces that have really brought me to this point have been getting into my professional career and into some research in active living and realizing that there really wasn't a lot of information. There were a lot of assumptions and not a lot of evidence that really backed those assumptions, and that really needing, starting with just describing what in the world does rural active living look like after Salas's work brought the environment into the picture, strong forces. What does it like that? How do we measure it? And then really spending time since then, realizing that there are a lot of disparities that are different and unique in rural areas. And it's not just a one-stop solution usually. And so trying to be intentional, saying if we're gonna impact change for all, how do we do that? And thinking about rural and trying to understand rural as its own area and own community, people living and thriving there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So you started talking a little bit about how, so we're really focusing this on the call to action paper you led with a bunch of fantastic co-authors from around the country, myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you started talking a little bit of why that came about, but I did want to make sure to ask, a little bit of background, why you decided that paper was important, how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir at the moment, but we're
going to bring more into the choir.
More people into the choir. So really just, I think that realization that enough of us did not find, I guess enough of us were finding lack of information that was already out there and struggles in trying to make the case for the importance of rural being its own independently considered space. That doesn't necessarily mean that rural is always different than urban or suburban settings, but just this need to recognize that there could be differences, and there, especially from an environmental context and some policy perspectives, our experiences were showing us in the research that we were doing that there's a need to, one, call it out and name it, and also bring about some of these other challenges, and some of those that are outlined, and I know you've already posted, that really caused a lot of continued conversation around like what is rural and how many different definitions there are, but even all the way down to the idea that one, oftentimes rural is seen as just a small town or a small city, and realizing that yes, there might be some rural communities or the town hubs of some rural communities that do function like a small city, but oftentimes there's just so many different nuances, and being public health folk and trying to really be true to, let's start where our community is and understand that there are nuances that we need to start and understand rural. And really that call to, there are challenges, there are gaps, and we need to see how we can start filling those gaps and building the evidence base.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So it was a lot of stuff coming together, a lot of folks interested in it. And you concluded, so you went through all the evidence and broke it up into the sections, obviously informed by Jim Salas's work and the model, the social ecological model. And at the end, you brought it, and that's really the focus on this, is really the 8 key points in the call to action. I wanted to focus on a couple and see if you talk with our big audience about about what things have gone on since then, because there's been some good work since the paper was published in 2016. There are two I wanted to focus on, and you started to talk about those. End the practice of treating rural settings as less populated, as quote unquote less populated urban areas, because they are unique socially, culturally, and in the built environment context. And then also planning for the diversity that does exist in rural areas, because I think there's definitely a stereotype that all rural places are the same. So do you want to talk a little bit about those and what's been going on since then?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start broader, like kind of some things that are more broadly been going on since this paper came out, which to me was a very important step in the broader conversation. And I'm so thankful that I had colleagues that were willing to partner on that. Kind of around the same time, just to loop in one other piece, I know in which you've already described in the description of this series, as well as the blog, that we really came out of some active living research roundtable discussions that had occurred across several years. One specifically the lessons from my front porch that we're building on right now. And but at the same time, there was an original physical activity policy research network that was funded by CDC, and that was the under the WashU leadership. And in their final few years, there was a call to, I guess there was an interest for there being a work group that looked at conducting a systematic literature review, describing physical activity policy and environmental strategies to preventing obesity, and the common community measures for obesity prevention that were put out by CDC from a rural context. And Dr. Cindy Perry was part of that group, who has definitely joined forces with some others. And so there was that systematic lit review that came out and really concluded, not with 8 specific calls to action, but some of the conclusions were similar in terms of there's really not a lot of information out here. Here are a few things, but there's a lot of things that seem to be being tailored in different ways. And maybe we actually need to have different measures for rural spaces, and maybe we need to think about things differently in rural areas. And so some of the conclusions were very similar and published right around the same time as the call to action that I think really led some of that charge and that further in that conversation. Since that year, where the conference where we presented the information, the publication came out, this other systematic literature review came out, there were, I think one of the good things that I found that I think has been a good movement was a concerted effort and work group that was formed within the second version of the Physical Activity Policy Research Network, called PLUS, that was under the leadership at Johns Hopkins University, and that we've had now for 5-6 years a rural working group focused on policy and environmental approaches in rural spaces. And so in that work and in that group, we've had lots of great conversations. We've been able to share ideas. There's been work trying to learn from which rural communities are doing it well, with some positive deviance work that you've been leading. That's been just very informative. And then some other work around dissemination and implementation efforts in rural communities. And more recently, and I know you're going to speak with some of these more innovative new oncomers, looking at the role of libraries and looking at some of the comprehensive plans in rural communities. And so there's just that's been, I think, one really tremendous development in this area, that there are people that are coming together, being able to share ideas and really have a broader look across multiple rural communities, because they aren't all the same. And so trying to really be intentional, trying to understand some of those nuances and understand how we need to think about that. Since then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask if do you want to talk a little bit about Play Streets, work you're involved in, and specifically, I think it would be really interesting to hear the diversity of the 4 different places I know that you worked in.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Physical Activity Research Center, which was funded, I guess, about 3 or 4 years ago, and it wasn't focused specifically on rural, but I think leading into the Play Streets work, that group was able to recognize and for active living for all kids, that rural was off the map and needed more emphasis. And so several projects included rural across that team. And I think that was a win, because now we have looking at summertime versus school year time accelerometer data with rural and urban and suburban, but there's been some things. And in that was a project that you just referenced, Play Streets work, that Dr. Keisha Pollock-Porter at Johns Hopkins and I partnered with 4 diverse rural communities across the nation. So Western Maryland up near you. So thanks for showing up and helping out with that and your kids showing up. And then and that was a community organization that was a health department that we partnered with there, and then partnering with the church in Warren, North Carolina, and then partnering with a tribal preventive health services group out of Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, and then partnering with the AgriLife Extension office in Central Texas and Cameron, Texas. And so within those areas, we were really trying to say, hey, can play streets work in rural communities, and what does that need to look like from a tailoring standpoint if tailoring needs to happen, or can they even work in rural areas? So play streets have been implemented in cities. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they're temporary shutdown, usually of a city street for a set amount of hours, and it's less organized, it's more free play. There's some supervision, and Chicago's been doing them since 2012, and so many other cities across the nation. Chicago might be the best documented from that standpoint from cities. So we partnered with these 4 communities, pretty diverse. They were selected based on being low income, rural, by looking at some RUCA codes, for those of you familiar with some of the definitions, and then also diverse in terms of priority populations. And then we had predominantly African-American community in North Carolina, Caucasian in Maryland, Latino in Texas, and American Indian in Oklahoma. And so we really thought we would see some different things. And what we found was in that work, just some take homes, is one, yes, play streets are effective. They provide opportunities for kids to play, for people to come together, for neighbors to talk, especially in summertime. They didn't look the same as they looked in cities, though. They weren't on a block where parents could just look out their windows and see their kids playing. It was people were driving in from towns over because it was an opportunity that was free for their kids to come and see other kids and play in the summer. And oftentimes it wasn't on a street. We did see it on a few streets, but many times it wasn't on a street, because if you're in a small town where there's one street going through, one main street going through, you can't just shut it down. So we really saw probably one of the bigger, there's one other big tailoring that I'll mention in just a second, but it was parking lots, it was fields, it was school grounds, it was parks, it were places that weren't being used for physical activity. And the other thing we really saw that I think points to a specific strength and characteristic of rural communities is that they were coupled or put together with other events happening in the community. So people were already coming in, so the transportation piece kind of disappeared, or play streets also had other services happening at the same time. So it was a back to school fair at the play street, so kids could be active there, or it was a summer meals feeding program where there was a play street kind of in combination there. So it was pooling those resources, since people in rural communities and many low income communities wear multiple hats, and also trying to just provide as many good and kids to engage in.
Yeah, that's an awesome summary. Yeah, the workforce is thin, so you got to, everybody, you know, the school teacher is the health person, is the person that mows the lawn, and, you know, is everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe just one more question, just thinking as you're talking, I wonder, I mean, what do you see as most hopeful in this research or practice space of rural, you know, getting people more active in rural places? We're going to talk with Jeff Whitfield from CDC at some point, and his research is really interesting in the epidemiology of it. What do you see as most hopeful on the ground and from the work you're doing, both from organizing these groups as well as play streets and other projects you're involved in?
You know, I think there's a lot of strength in the fact that rural communities, and while they're very diverse across rural communities, of course, but there's a lot of strength in the creative solutions and the innovative mindset that I believe is at the heart of rural communities. And so that idea of, oh, of course we can just add one more thing to a program that's already happening, which is similar to our play streets work, of yes, we need to do this because our kids don't have options. There's this rallying force and a drive to make it and own it that I feel that might be part of cities as well, but it's definitely evident in the rural work in terms of our partners in Western Maryland were, one of their realizations was like, wow, we didn't realize that we could really add physical activity to everything we're already doing. It doesn't take, we can bring out this loose equipment and we can provide options for kids. And man, we should be doing this all of our smaller programs, whether it has to do with physical activity or not. And so I think some of it's more of the creative solutions, and I'm focused on a kid-oriented program with Play Streets, but really it could be your whole family's engaging, and you have seniors that are involved and they're getting out there. Our Warrenton, North Carolina site had line dancing for some of the seniors as part of their Play Street. And so I think it was just this idea of physical activity and this active play and these creative solutions that bring communities together around something positive. So it's like, we can do this. So there's a capacity piece around it. There's some collective efficacy that's building within that. And at the same time, there's this, oh my gosh, now I can talk to my neighbor. I can see you. I know who you are. And that's a benefit regardless of community. But I think in rural communities, because we're so spread out and there's less resources, and often this summer it's either very programmed or nothing. Often either at camp or it's a very structured sport programming, or the solutions are a little bit more, they need to be creative. And I think that when you talk to Noah about the library's work and some of the creative solutions they're working with, and some other things that are materializing kind of that community engaged evidence that we're trying to capture and learn from, I think is one of the huge solutions. So Play Streets, I think, can be part of that. I don't think Play Streets can solve every single problem in the world, but in terms of something that's doable, yes, it takes people power. But it's doable, it's affordable, and it lets kids come out and laugh and have a good time, and they're physically active as much or more as they are in recess, and in summer they don't have recess. So I would say that's some of that piece.
Yeah. What's your favorite physical activity to conclude?
Thank you. That's a hard question. So I personally love, I'll narrow it down to 3. You can't just say one. So I say being on my bike. I love being on my bike, actually out in rural country roads. I'm not a mountain biker, but I'm a road rider. And I love challenging. I love feeling my legs just about die on hills. And I get a freeing sensation. In fact, I often want to yodel while I'm on my bike. Not that I want to yodel, but I have that desire that comes out of me. I love hiking and walking with family members, and sometimes could be to a jog, but I think that just engages. I can walk and talk with my friends, with my family, my kids. I love that communal part of walking and hiking and being outdoors and in nature. And I love dancing. And so we have dance parties in the living room. I've got a 2- and a 5-year-old right now. We're all about dance parties, regardless of the music, whether it's Disney, Shark, or something that we've chosen, U2, you name it, we've got it going on.
Nice. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think I'm going to end with that and just thanking you again for all the hard work you're doing and the leadership on multiple groups. Make sure you take time for yourself to have more dance parties in the living room.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Yeah, I really appreciate your leadership on this and for taking the time to talk with everybody about your work and the other great things happening in rural physical activity.
Awesome. And I would just say one last thing that I won't spend much time on, is that there's some work that you are partnering, thankfully, with me on out of Voices for Healthy Kids. That's policy oriented, that will develop across the next year, that I think will help inform some advocacy and policy pieces too, which is good news.
Awesome.
So, thanks for your time, Christiaan.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Umstattd Meyer from Baylor University.
To learn more about the research presented in this talk, read Rural Active Living, A Call to Action, published in the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice. Available online at journals.lww.com/JPHMP.